Hi, y'all, and welcome to the live stream tonight. Well, this is sort of a strange and disjointed live stream because we are on verdict watch. We are waiting for the jury to come back in the Lori Vallow Daybell trial. We've been following it for 6 weeks now, longer if you count the first time I did some videos on it. But we have been following it every turn, every twist, the evidence. We went through all of the evidence last night together. And now, at long last, we had closing arguments from both sides today. Jury instructions were given by the court, and the jury is out and deliberating, and they haven't gone home for the day. It's only 5:15 in Idaho, so it's not that early, but they've been used to going home every day at 3:30, and they have not gone home yet, which suggests to me that they're pretty serious about reaching a verdict, maybe even today. So I debated on this, how do I wait for that? Because there's going to be a 1 hour wait once the court announces before the verdict is read. That's pretty common in cases because what happens is the lawyers often don't even stay around the courthouse. It depends, but sometimes you do. But sometimes they go back to their offices and wait because it could be a while. It's particularly in smaller towns where your office might be right across the way. Then you might go back to your office and then the court calls and says, get back over here. We've got a verdict. And so you need to get over there and rush over there. Personally, I've always stayed around the courthouse. It is, you think in your mind, this is going to be really productive time. I'm going to be able to get something done because I'm through with this massive case that I've worked on for so long. But it is so stressful. It is so scary the whole time because you are waiting to know what 12 complete strangers are going to do about your case. And so it is not a time when I've ever gotten any work done, no matter what I brought or no matter what I thought in advance. So, and I want to say thank you to Letitia Harold for the super sticker. And I also want to say thanks to Kim Turner for the super sticker. Thank you both very much. It really does encourage me. And I appreciate that a lot. And I think, oh, Bobby Cat. Thank you, Bobby Cat. And so I've been debating, okay, how do we do this? Because I definitely want to be live when we find out about the verdict. But at the same time, we have our 7 o'clock time and I knew you'd all be waiting and wondering what happened today. And so I didn't want to leave that out. So here's what I suggest. I'm going to be kind of watching over here in the chat. If you would, if you can follow some of you on Twitter and see whether there's an announcement that the jury is coming back, we'll have a 1 hour wait then. What I'm going to do is go through all of my material that I already have prepared about the closing argument. I'll go through that and tell you what happened so you'll understand what were the big arguments that both sides wanted to bring. And I will give you a spoiler alert. The defense closing argument was great. It was really, really good. And it was about time that they kind of brought it to the trial. Now, does that mean that Lori Vallow Daybell is going to get off? No, that is not what it means. But it means that it was a great closing argument. And I think for the first time, we really had something to understand about what the defense was and what the defense could be. I thought it was really strong. So just to let you know, I'm going to be going through that and you'll hear the arguments on both sides. I just think the jury may come back today. I think they may have stayed at the courthouse because they thought they were perhaps close enough. They were specifically asked to review some evidence. The prosecution asked them to review the body cam when Lori was served in Hawaii, and also asked them, it's not very long, a couple of minutes, I think, and then also asked them, and ironically, so did the defense, both of them wanted them to review the recorded phone call when Chad called Lori. Lori was in jail. Chad was sitting in the car right there in his front yard or I guess at the gate to go out. I'm not exactly sure where he was sitting. He was in the car and he was watching them search his backyard. And as he saw them search the backyard, he calls Lori. And the prosecution said he sounds so discouraged. And both of them see how guilty they sound. They know they're about to be discovered. And Ironically, the defense said, I want you to go look at that too, because she doesn't sound upset. She sounds clueless, like she had no idea that this was actually something serious, that anybody was buried in the backyard. She didn't know. That's what the defense argued. So we'll go through all of those arguments. And let me say thank you to Susan Miller. I appreciate that. And Beverly Bigglesworth. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate that. So let's get into what the closing arguments were. And by the way, be sure to hit that like button, because we'll get the video out to more people, and subscribe, because we are covering the best, the most interesting cases around. And may I say, the real reason to join the channel is the chat, because we have such interesting people, informed, curious, questions. It's a great chat. So that's a reason in and of itself to join the channel. So please subscribe. So let's go through what happened today. The court started with that motion for judgment of acquittal that the defense filed. The defense, that it's a normal argument frequently filed by the defense, and it says that we don't think the defense, we think you could look at the evidence and decide just that there's not enough to sustain a conviction, and you could just let Lori walk free. You could just acquit her on some of the counts. And so we ask you, court, to look at that and see whether or not you agree with us. And I said last night and the night before, because it was filed 2 days ago, I said, there's zero chance that that is going to be granted. In general, it's really rare that that's going to be granted, but there was really, really zero chance in this case. And yes, that's exactly what happened. It was denied. The court is supposed to decide whether or not the evidence is insufficient to sustain a conviction. In other words, it's so little evidence that even if the jury voted guilty, you just couldn't do it. It would just be wrong. In this case, the court said, look, there have been not just a little bit of evidence, there have been weeks worth of evidence. And so definitely there's been plenty of that. And I think I'm missing. Oh, thank you, Marie. I appreciate it. Marie Starr, thank you. And Luca, I appreciate that. Good to see everybody in the chat. It is good to have you back. The court then went through the jury instructions, and the jury instructions, there were 39 of them, which is a large number, but really not excessive or unusual, I didn't think. Every juror got a copy. That was unusual. I've never seen that done, and I think it's a fantastic idea. I think it's a really good one. So a lot of them were sort of common, what you would expect to find, like the defendant's presumed innocent. The defendant does not have to produce evidence or prove she's innocent. Instead, the state has the burden of proving she's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So that would be something you would typically expect. That the defendant has a right not to testify, especially important in this case, because Lori Vallow elected not to go on the stand. There was some speculation about it, but certainly after the Summer Shiflett phone call, I felt like there was no real way she could go on the stand. And the text messages too just made it really impossible, I thought. Shauna Gunn, thank you. I appreciate it. So the court also told the jury, what the lawyers say is argument. That's not evidence. And that might surprise you if you aren't used to sort of the legal field. You might be thinking to yourself, when the lawyer gets up there, I can make a choice as a juror based on what the lawyer says. Actually, the lawyer is just supposed to explain or even argue about what was heard, but what the lawyer says itself is not evidence. It's like what I say tonight, that's not evidence in the court. And that's even true for the lawyers representing the parties right there in the courtroom. Then the court also said that it talked a little bit about, well, a lot, about what the legal rules, what the legal ground rules will be. Talked about the fact that conspiracy to commit murder, because remember, Lori is accused of conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell, not of having done it herself, but of conspiracy. And that's an agreement by two or more people to commit first-degree murder. And the court told the jury, it may be that they don't agree on every detail. That's kind of normal. And you can show it by evidence of oral agreement. It could be a written agreement. It doesn't have to be something formal and notarized. It's nothing like that. But if they just get together and agree, this is how we're going to proceed, That's the agreement that the court was talking about. And we also found out that the jury is going to have access to the witness testimony as well as the evidence. Again, something I think is a really good idea. And I realized today there was a small miracle that occurred in this case, which is not one single alternate was lost. When you think about that, that is astonishing. A 6-week trial, nobody lost. That's very unusual, very unlike the Murdoch trial where they almost ran into trouble, even though there were 6 alternates. Here, there were 6 alternates, and not one of those was needed, at least so far. The jury's out deliberating, obviously. So and I'm watching over here to see if anybody sees on Twitter anywhere that there is going to be a verdict. That's great. I'd love to know that. Please let me know. We're right now still waiting. So at this point, 6 numbers were drawn randomly. 6 juror numbers. Remember, there was like 1, 2, 15, 42. Those were the numbers of the jurors. And they drew 6 numbers randomly and sent those 6 home. The 12 remaining jurors are going to make the actual final decision in the case. And can you imagine how frustrating that would be if you actually sat for 6 solid weeks, 1 week of jury deliberation and 5 weeks of testimony, and then the court said, you were just an alternate, thanks for your service, you can head on home? Wow, that would be really brutal, because I think with all of that investment, you would really want to be able to say something about the case. If nothing else, to go and talk to everybody else about the case. You've been waiting all this time, saying nothing to anybody, forming opinions, thinking about things, and not able to bounce them off anybody. I can only imagine that's really frustrating. And I want to say thank you to Luca very much. And Kay Oakley, thank you to you as well. But those 6 jurors are not actually released. Technically, they're released in that they can go home. They're not going to sit with the other jurors. They're not going to deliberate, but they might be recalled. If something happened to one of the jurors presently sitting, then there would need to be a replacement, and that person would be called in. So the judge said, 15-minute dinner break. Okay, I'll talk about that in just a minute. Thank you. Thank you very much. But if the jury makes a decision, this 12, they don't lose anybody, those 6 have nothing to do with it. They're finished. They finished their job. They never really get to talk about the case with anybody. But while they're waiting, they cannot discuss the case because they might be recalled, because it's possible that they would be recalled. So I think from Hippie Chick, I got this comment about, I don't know for sure, but thank you for putting that in the chat. I appreciate this, about the jury taking a 15-minute dinner break. I think that's super encouraging that they'll make a decision tonight. That's a really short dinner break, and suggests they're like, let's get this thing done. Let's get this decided. We need to eat. We don't want to lose it, but let's get it done. It suggests they might have a little bit of time left, but that they are moving along and they don't want to stop. So that's a super good sign. I'm glad to hear that. I don't know how they manage to take a 15-minute break. There must be a ton of places to eat right around there. That's really short. Usually you would think just to walk across the street, it's going to take you longer than that. So we had the closing arguments today, and they were on both sides really good. I thought the rebuttal for the prosecution was especially strong, and the defense argument was really strong. Really, for the first time, I just felt like, okay, the defense brought it today. And as I said at the beginning, if you're just now coming in, does that mean that Lori Vallow Daybell is going to walk free? No. But it does mean that it was a good closing argument. So I'll explain to you why I think that. I'll explain to you what they said, and we'll get into that. But let's start, of course, with the prosecution, because they went first. And they had a couple of big themes. The first theme, I would say, was that the plan was driven by Lori's desire for and use of money, power, and sex. That was their argument throughout, that money, power, and sex was both part of what drove Lori and part of what caused her to drive other people. Those things were what mattered. Not, by the way, religion. The prosecution walked back from religion very fast, very hard, arguing that they were not being punished or they were not being accused of anything because of their religion. And I'll explain that as we go through. Thank you, Diane Husseini. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So the prosecution started with an overview and talked about the fact that Tylee was burned and buried, and Lori kept collecting her money, her Social Security money, that Lori never reported her missing and lied to multiple people so she could keep getting the money for Tylee. I personally felt like the prosecution overdid the money. It's not that that isn't relevant to their grand theft, but I don't see it as the motive for the murder. But it's not that she didn't do that or that she can't be convicted of that. I just didn't see it as the strongest of the motives that the prosecution had. Then the prosecutor also talked about, and by the way, it was Rob Wood, the Madison County prosecuting attorney who did the closing argument for the state. JJ was a 7-year-old boy with special needs, and his mouth was duct taped so as to silence him, and a white plastic bag was placed over his head. It was secured tightly with duct tape wrapped around from his forehead to his neck. He fought, and then they wrapped duct tape around his wrists and his ankles. It truly is absolutely appalling, and the prosecution just laid it out that bluntly. And Lori, they said, never reported he was missing. In fact, the prosecution had to find his body. The state had to find his body buried. And that she kept collecting his money, even though he was dead. And I think it's pretty clear from her conversation with Summer Shiflett that she knew he was dead. I think the grand theft is super strong. I think their argument on the grand theft is very, very strong. As for Tammy, the prosecution said Tammy was asphyxiated a week after a masked gunman, and the prosecution believes that to be Alex Cox, Lori's brother, attempted to shoot her, and that Lori was conveniently, it was no coincidence, it was no accident, that Lori was conveniently gone for that and gone for the actual successful murder. She was in Missouri trying to cast Viola, the evil spirit, out of Tammy when Tammy was shot at, and then she was in Hawaii when Tammy was actually killed. And according to the prosecution, there was $430,000 available in life insurance from 2 different policies, and Lori directly benefited from that. That's also one of their stronger arguments for Chad Daybell. He's not tried right now. He's going to be tried separately. And then the prosecution said, with all of those horrible things having happened to her family, to Chad's wife, they felt free. They were dancing on the beach. They were getting married. They were having fun. They were living the high life, the good life in Hawaii. Then the prosecution says, after the attempted shooting of Brandon Boudreaux, which happened earlier, even before before Tammy was shot and killed, that Rexburg police then began the investigation. They got the call looking for JJ. They began the investigation into the missing kids. Tammy's body was exhumed. The kids' bodies were finally found in June of 2020, almost a year really after they went missing. They both went missing in September of 2019. Thank you, KD. I appreciate it. And I will get to the defense's closing arguments. I'm going to go through their entire argument. So the prosecution then went to the legal elements and said that one of them was conspiracy, and said, look, we have to prove that Lori conspired to murder Tammy. And conspiracy, they said, all that means is a crime of agreement, that people agreed that it should be done. And Lori did agree, they said, and she agreed furthermore to have Tylee killed and to steal her money, to have JJ killed, to steal his money, that Lori intended for those events to actually happen. And that's all the prosecution said conspiracy means, that any of the conspirators performed an overt act in furtherance. And they said you only need to find one act by one conspirator in furtherance. That means an overt act just means something clear, something obvious, and in furtherance to further to make it possible. So in other words, if everybody wants this to happen and one person takes a step toward it, that's attributed to all the people who were the conspirators. And that's what the prosecution was saying. And first degree murder, they said, doesn't mean that Lori had to take an axe or a knife and do something herself. It just means that she aided, abetted, advised, or counseled in the murder. And if you find any of those things, they said, you need to convict her. And with Tammy, they said that was clearly a conspiracy where Lori was involved. The prosecution used that term. The grand theft was related to the money that she stole that would have, they said, that would have belonged to the government. And there was, the prosecution also defined malice. What does it mean to murder someone with malice aforethought? What does that mean? And they said, remember, jury, it can be express or implied. That means express means you say, I want the person to be killed. But it also can be implied. And they said, in this case, we've got both. And they specifically are going to point to the fact that Lori made comments about the death numbers being only 2 or 3, and weren't they lower, and was this ever going to happen? And she was tired of dealing with these demons and zombies. So the prosecution said that, and the prosecution talked about aiding and abetting, because that was one of the things they say Lori did. She aided, she abetted in the murder, even if she didn't wield a knife herself. And they said that aiding and abetting is just exactly the same as pulling the trigger. There's no difference in terms of the law. The overt acts, they talked about the fact that you've got to find at least one happened beyond a reasonable doubt, and they listed a bunch. And by the way, the overt act doesn't have to be something illegal. It just has to be something in furtherance of the conspiracy. In other words, something that's done in order to help the conspiracy go along. So here are some of the overt acts that they talked about, or facts that they talked about and brought up as some of the most important that they thought the jury should think about as it made its decision. One is that they said, look, nobody's being charged here for religious beliefs, but for using them to justify murder. I thought that was a good distinction, and said it does not matter what they believe. This is about as quote, it matters what they did. They can believe whatever they want, but when they use that to justify homicide, that's another matter. And the prosecution argued that Lori used religion. She used it to manipulate Alex, to manipulate even Chad, who also is charged with these murders, and their friends. And that and I thought back to that comment she made to Melanie. Melanie was saying, I feel on the secret recorded call, Melanie said, I feel uncomfortable with these missing people. And I just seen this whole thing, there's now 2 people who are dead, and I feel uncomfortable with all of this. And then Lori said to her something along the lines of, it looks like you're listening to the devil. It looks like you are being taught things by evil spirits, and suggested to her, it was very manipulative, saying, if you don't believe that we did everything properly, then you yourself must be dark, or must be being controlled by dark entities. And I remembered and thought of that. Then the prosecution talked about the move to Rexburg as an overt act. I thought that was a little stretch. What they're saying is they moved to Rexburg because they planned to do whatever it took to get Lori and Chad together and to get everybody else out of the way, and to begin the process of leading the 144,000 in the end times. Now, Lori, they said, also never reported her kids missing, and they dwelled on that she changed the bank account to get the Social Security benefits from her kids. I personally never thought that was a very strong argument, because the Social Security benefits were never meant to be, as they were being used in the family, as like a personal spending account for Tylee. It was supposed to be for her care while she was a minor. So I never thought that was anything particularly serious. But nonetheless, it was sort of obvious that Lori changed that. That way, there was no problem if something happened to Tylee. And the prosecution says would say, I think the reason that she did that is so that if she would have access to the funds, because if they went straight into Tylee's account and Tylee wasn't around, maybe Lori wouldn't be able to access them without a death certificate, say, or some kind of explanation for why Tylee wasn't showing up at the bank herself. The prosecution also talked about the text message about Tammy being in limbo and being possessed by a zombie, and said that in every situation, the person who was about to die would suddenly become dark, real dark, and then they would go close to death, and then their bodies or their persons would disappear. And the prosecution says this was a pattern. This wasn't a one-time thing. And it happened with JJ, Tylee, Tammy, and also with Charles Vallow, Lori's husband, at the time she met Chad. The prosecution also talked about the fact that Lori looked up wedding dresses, and on the very day that Tammy Daybell was being buried, no time wasting, no grass growing under her feet, she was already looking up wedding dresses and ready to move on with Chad to their future wedded life. And the prosecution pointed out, and this is probably some of the most somber testimony, I think, was that she told Melanie Gibb and David Warwick, now Melanie's husband and her boyfriend, that JJ had become a zombie. On the night JJ was last seen, Melanie and David saw JJ being carried in on Alex's shoulder. They assumed he was alive. It was never fully clear, but it was after that that there was the statement the next morning. They got up, JJ is gone. And meanwhile, David's had that weird, wild dream. They knock on the door of Lori's room and she doesn't open up, and they text Lori, they text Chad, no one is awake. The next morning they get up and JJ's gone, and Lori says he was a zombie, and said that he was a zombie and was climbing up in the cabinets, and that she sent him with Alex. David Warwick even asked to have him brought back so David could give him a blessing, and Lori said, no, he's with Chad, we're just going to leave him there. The overt acts could even happen with someone who is now deceased, like Alex Cox. And some of the things that the prosecution drew attention to, some of the evidence that they thought was the most important, was that Alex visited gun ranges, that he went to the Sportsman Warehouse right before someone shot at Tammy, and they produced a receipt that was bought in cash. They couldn't prove it was Alex's, but from some of the things on there, they said they believed that this was Alex's receipt, and these were the things he had bought in order to allow him to shoot at, but miss, Tammy Daybell. The prosecution also talked about the fact that Alex Cox was located at the church near Chad's house on the night that Tammy died, that he was searching on his phone for things like prepping an AR rifle in the cold, like shooting through a Dodge Dakota. I guess, would it be possible? What would happen if you shot through a Dodge Dakota? I know there's a lot of stuff on the internet, but is that really there? Has someone actually done stuff on whether or not you can shoot through a Dodge Dakota? It just seems so specific. Thank you, Fishface. I appreciate that. Then the phone, they talked about Alex's phone and the GPS on it pinging or hitting at the gate to Chad's property, and then at the burn pit where parts of Tylee were found, and then where Tylee was buried. And that his phone was all over that yard on the very night they say Tylee disappeared, sometime in between that overnight period. Chad, meanwhile, they believed they also had strong evidence about Chad, and here's what they talked about. His search for south-southwest winds, which they say was because he planned to burn Tylee's body. He wanted to know whether or not the neighbors would be alerted. There was also that truly strange raccoon text by Chad Daybell to his wife, Tammy, where Chad said, I shot a raccoon and had to bury him in the pet cemetery, and meanwhile also decided to burn some limbs. And the prosecution says that was just covering up because he figured Tammy might notice that someone had been using the fire pit, she might notice a brand new grave and wonder what it was. So he just wrote this to kind of cover tracks. To me, the single biggest piece of evidence I would have to say in the trial was another thing they mentioned, and that was Chad's reference to their relatives as obstacles. And when do we get rid of them? And the obstacles, calling the very people who died obstacles as if they stand in the way of getting the mission done, the thing that Chad, the thing that Lori, were the things they were supposed to accomplish. And I thought that was really a significant piece of evidence, and they mentioned it. Kitty Corner, thank you. I appreciate that. Chad got a burner phone on October 9th, the prosecution pointed out, which just so happened to be the very day that somebody shot at Tammy Daybell. And there were 15 text messages between Chad and Alex on the day Tammy was shot at. And they said, what tied Chad and Alex together? These 15 text messages, why would they text each other? The thing that tied them together, the prosecution said, was Lori. Lori was the connection between the two of them. They also noted again that someone had deleted an image from Tammy's phone on the 18th. I really wondered what that was. There was no suggestion. The prosecution, I assume, has no idea. They would have produced it if they could have, but it had been deleted. You just wonder, did Chad take a picture of Tammy's body as proof, or what happened? I just wondered, what was this image and why was it deleted? The prosecution also talked to the jury about the planning that went into the 3 murders that they accused Lori of. They said these weren't just spur of the moment things. They were planned in advance. For example, they said, here's how you, the jury, can know that. First of all, Alex Cox only spent 17 minutes at Chad's house the day that JJ died. The grave, they said, a grave, rocks arranged carefully on it, plywood. That didn't happen in 17 minutes. You don't manage to dig that in 17 minutes. What the prosecution says that means is it was premeditated. It was planned. There wasn't really an explanation for how they managed to do that without Tammy noticing or without any, because I understand Chad's adult son lived in the home with them, but no one seemed to notice. So I don't know what the prosecution believes happened, but they say somebody was planning for this and they prepared all of the things that were needed for this grave. Now, the defense also said, on the planning, the prosecution said the fact that Lori was out of town, that was no accident. That was very intentional. The fact that she was out of town when somebody shot at Tammy, the fact that she was out of town when Tammy died was just to give her an alibi should anyone ever accuse her of this. It was actually planned and intentional and evidence that she was involved in that planning. The prosecution also noted that comment that we talked about 2 nights ago, that really amazing text where she asked Chad about how close her children's numbers are to death. And Chad says, they really aren't that close. I forget, they were 2 and 3 or something, and talks about how he's going to give pain to Tylee, and JJ is very near death. And her response is, that is so sweet. And the prosecution says, there's no accident here. She wanted the kids gone. She wanted them gone. She was encouraging their murder. And that's first-degree murder, jury. So that was their argument to that. There was also a particular text where Lori asked, are JJ and Tammy at 0 yet? Like, are they near death? Like, how long is this going to take? And the prosecution said those text messages showed she was impatient. This was what she wanted. It wasn't just something that someone was forcing on her. The prosecution also talked about some of the things they believed showed guilty acts by Lori and by Chad, but particularly by Lori, since that's the case here. First of all, they really wanted the jury to review and specifically called out that phone call from Chad to Lori in jail. And they said that it was in the middle of the search of Chad's property. Law enforcement is about to find the bodies of JJ and Tylee buried in Chad Daybell's backyard. And he calls Lori. She's in jail. She's in jail because she has not produced JJ, even though she was ordered by a court to do that. And so he calls her and begins to talk about and says, law enforcement's here and they're looking. And the prosecution and the defense, very ironically, both thought this was so important that the jury should listen to it one more time, which I assume is what they're doing. The prosecutor said, you can hear the fear and the guilt in their voices. And the defense said, not in Lori's. You can hear that in Chad's, not so much in Lori's. She just seems clueless. I have to agree with the defense on that. I thought the same thing about the phone call. She said, oh, so are they looking in the house? And Chad says, no, they're not. They're looking in the yard. So are they seizing things? And he says, no, they're not seizing things. They're looking in the yard. And she does seem to be disconnected on that. I don't know what the reason was, and maybe it was just good acting. But it was interesting that they both thought that was one of the most important pieces of evidence, and both of them thought that the jury ought to go back and listen to that in particular. Within a week of the kids' deaths, the prosecution talked about, Lori was already talking about getting the money, the Social Security money, making sure she secured that. And the prosecution told the jury, you only have to find that she got $1,000, not all the money we allege, just $1,000 that was not hers, that should have been reported and turned back over to Social Security. If you find that, that's grand theft. And I think they have a super strong argument there. And I loved this quote. I thought it was really good. She lied and she lied and she lied about where they were. And while she lied, she kept collecting the money. That was sort of in a nutshell their argument. And they ended with sort of a reminder of the horror of what happened. They talked about the fact that Tylee was buried in an animal cemetery, something that particularly bothered Summer Shiflett too, where they also found a dog and a cat, that there was charred flesh. She was dismembered. There was a chunk of concrete on her skull. They found pieces of her in the shed. There was DNA on the pickaxe. Her blood was on the shovel. She'd been stabbed in the pelvis. I mean, frankly, it just goes on and on. With JJ, they said his grave was prepared in advance. This was planned, is what the prosecution said. And they talked about the duct tape and just it was unpleasant. And the jury has seen the pictures and the jury knows for a fact. For Tammy, the prosecution said she had bruises on her arms, as JJ had, which the prosecution says is a sign she was held down. And that the autopsy showed nothing in her body would have killed her. There was nothing wrong with her. She was not dying of natural causes, they said. There was one thing I thought was significant for appeal, because the prosecution said they didn't really argue the Charles Vallow case. Now, it came in detail in the trial. A lot of information came in about the Charles Vallow shooting by Alex Cox, Lori's brother. Charles Vallow being Lori's husband at the time. And so the prosecution said Charles Vallow, Tylee Ryan, JJ, Tammy, all of them died within a short time frame. And how were they all tied together? Lori. They said Lori tied all of those things together. Now, other than that, they didn't do a lot of description about Charles Vallow. They did make that one comment about him. So now, I said earlier, I'm going to get to the defense argument. I really felt like the defense brought it today. I think I said at the beginning, is it going to change things? No, it's not going to change things in my view, but it was a really strong closing argument. And I was glad to see it, because I felt like her defense team had not really come forward. And although I know it's easy to say, well, justice is Lori doesn't get anything. And I totally understand the feeling. At the same time, I think justice is about our system. It's about us. It's not about the individual on trial. So I was glad to see that there was a vigorous argument for her. And will it make any difference? No, I don't believe it will. So according to the defense, they said something we've heard throughout trial, that Lori protected her kids. He threw in there, do you remember how he kept trying to get in that the kids needed protecting from Joseph Ryan? There was always an objection to that. I don't think they ever got it in, but he just threw that in anyway. This is an example of what the judge says about, if somebody says it in closing argument, that doesn't mean it's evidence. But what she said was the kids needed protecting from Joseph Ryan, and Lori did that. Lori protected her kids, that she was always a good mom, that she helped JJ with his medical issues, that then there was a, quote, remarkable, dramatic change in Lori in October 2018. And that was when she met Chad. And 1 year after meeting Chad, the defense said 4 people are dead. And the defense attorney, Archibald, reminded the jurors that they shouldn't pay any attention to Charles's death because it's really not an issue here. This is about 3 deaths that occurred in Idaho, which is all the court has jurisdiction or power over. The death of Charles Vallow happened in Arizona, and in fact, Lori is going to be prosecuted in connection with that case, but it's not an issue in this case, even though a lot of evidence came in. That he talked about Lori getting evil glares from the audience, and I think that was an attempt to sort of make her more personable and to suggest she was a victim. I also thought it's probably kind of tone deaf in the situation. He said, you may think you haven't heard from Lori because she didn't actually get on the stand, but in truth, you have heard from her 6 different times. This is phone calls, body cam, podcasts. I don't know if that was really in her favor in that she lied, for example, on the body cam to the police. But he said she doesn't seem like a violent person. The podcast in particular suggested she was a kind person. And many people will say, kind person, how can you say that? I'm just saying that one piece of evidence, the podcast, the defense would argue, suggested she was a different kind of person than the person who would do the murder she's accused of here. And we'll get into that because they actually make that argument in just a minute. So the defense said, look, let's think about the suggestion that this was about money, power, and sex. Was it really about money? They said, and I personally never really agreed with that argument by the prosecution, but they said, look, Charles Vallow was making $400,000 or $500,000 a year. And Chad, on the other hand, had to be supported by his wife, Tammy, because he was such a poor author, such a poor publisher, he couldn't even make a living doing it. So why would anyone exchange Charles Vallow for Chad Daybell for money? It just doesn't make sense. She's not a money grubber. And then the defense also said, okay, this isn't really about power either. Because if it were about power, Lori would have a ton of followers, but that isn't the way it worked. Chad had a bunch of followers, and Lori didn't really have any followers, or converts, he called them. Chad did, but not Lori. So the defense said, look, Melanie, Audrey, Zulema, they followed Chad. They didn't follow Lori. It wasn't like she was getting something out of this. And then the defense said, it also could not conceivably have been about the sex. The defense said, look, people have sex outside of marriage every day. And if you look at the two of them, Charles and Chad, nobody's going to pick Chad. Everybody's going to pick Charles because he's more physically attractive. Now, Chad tells her she's a goddess and we were married in a previous life, so it's not really cheating because we're actually already married and we were best friends with Jesus and Jesus thinks it's fine, so we can do this. And so the defense says all of these show that this had nothing to do with the money, power, and sex that the prosecution is trying to convince you on. So then the defense turned to what the defense needed to do, saying, okay, the kids are dead, admitted, but did Lori do it? Was it Lori who did it? They talked about Kay Woodcock's testimony, the grandmother of JJ, who said that Charles and Lori were an all-American family, that she trusted Lori until late 2018, early 2019. And Brandon said the same thing, that Charles and Lori were great and were great parents until. Now, when they were finding the bodies, the defense pointed out, Chad was looking over his shoulder at the very spot where they were about to find a body. And then he sped away and was arrested. He knew the kids were in the backyard, the defense said, but Lori did not. Listen to that jail call, because I will say Lori says, are they in the house? Are they seizing things? And he says, no, they're in the yard. And she seems sort of almost like she has throughout the trial, as if things aren't really going through, like words come in and they don't ever register, or maybe they just pass through. It seems like she doesn't always get it. And it did seem like a disconnect on that phone call. Although, like I said, she could have been some good acting. And we will, don't worry, we'll get back into the evidence that I think shows exactly what was going on here. So when the defense also said Lori told everybody that the kids are safe, but her phone isn't in Chad's backyard. Maybe she really thought the kids were safe. Chad and Alex had their phones in the backyard, or Chad lived there. Alex had his phone. And it's true that they text her, but the prosecution never showed you what those text messages said. As far as we know, the text messages just said, do you want Coke or Diet Coke? It was just casual conversation. It doesn't mean she knew that the kids had been killed. The defense dumped all over Chad, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Chad, crazy, goofy. They talked about him that way. That in the blessing to Alex, he talked about opening the portals of time, the fourth creation, crazy. And here's a great quote, or pretty close, from the defense. To me, it's craziness. Opening the portals of time, third creation, fourth creation, great warriors, exaltation, but came back in the fifth creation. What in the heck is Chad talking about? He's the leader of his new church. He calls himself a patriarch, just goofy stuff. So the defense said, not Lori. This is all about Chad. That was what they've been hinting about, and they finally brought that full force to the defense argument. They also talked about Colby's testimony. Now, Colby is Lori's son, the still living son, and he said that Lori was a good mom, that she was a good mom when she raised him. The defense said, okay, if Lori planned to kill JJ, if that was something she really had in mind when she moved to Rexford, why would she hire a babysitter to come in and be with JJ? She interviewed and hired somebody to be with JJ ongoing. And she enrolled JJ at school. If the prosecution is right that the whole reason they moved to Rexford was to get away from people who knew them and to hide the kids so they could be murdered, then why would they enroll JJ at school? Why would they list both Tylee and JJ on the rental application? Why wouldn't you just do what the prosecution said, which is hide them? I thought this was a really strong argument. Now, remember, this is only about whether or not that one overt act, moving to Rexford, was entirely in furtherance or was in furtherance of the murders. And the prosecution says this is all a big scheme. The whole thing is just to get Lori and Chad together and unencumbered by all of these demons and difficult relatives, the obstacles, as Chad called them. Lori, the defense said, lied not because she knew about where Tylee and JJ were, and not because she was involved in the murder, but to protect Chad. That she lied. The defense said, how can someone have that much control over you? We've heard how reason and common sense go out the window sometimes when religious principles are involved. She never got insurance policies on her kids, the defense pointed out. She would have, they said, if she really planned to kill them. And remember that really chilling search she did about Gerber life insurance and life insurance for children? We don't know what that's about, but it was kind of frightening. He pointed out, the defense, Archibald, said that Summer, the sister of Lori, said to her on the phone in that jail call, said, Chad has lied to you. Chad has deceived you. And Summer said also that Lori was a good mom. All of this played into the defense argument that Lori was a good mom. It's all Chad. It's all Chad. She had no idea. The hair on the duct tape was a problem that the defense had to address because it is important. on the duct tape that was used to wrap around JJ was one of Lori's hairs. The defense said, look, decomposition fluid was in that same bag where they had the duct tape. Pajamas were in that, where law enforcement had picked it up. Kids' socks, a blanket. Said, I would hope all of you who are mothers, I hope your hair is somewhere on your kids' pajamas, socks, or blanket. The argument being it just got picked up somehow. It doesn't mean Lori was actively involved in duct taping JJ or was present when that happened. The defense also talked about Tammy, and I thought that they said it was not at all clear that Tammy was even murdered. That if it was murder, then Chad had to fool the coroner, had to fool law enforcement and his own kids. And this was as close to a quote as I can get, you're being asked to convict Lori on killing Tammy when Lori's in Hawaii and not even there. You're being asked to convict Lori on killing Tammy when it isn't even a homicide. So the defense said, look, JJ, Tylee, clearly somebody murdered them, but it wasn't Lori, it was Chad and Alex. And on Tammy, she wasn't even murdered. It's not even clear that she was murdered. The prosecution hasn't managed to prove that. They say she was asphyxiated, but they said she was asphyxiated because she died. They didn't really have evidence of that would indicate she was smothered, say with a pillow or something like that. They just concluded that. So the defense says Chad, granted, had a prophecy that Tammy would die before she was age 50. Maybe, the defense said, she knew about that. Maybe the whole reason she increased her life insurance was to benefit her family. Maybe she was a true believer. After all, the defense said, she was still with Chad, even though he was so nutty. And she stood by him, even when he went bankrupt, even when he was trying to sell his stupid books, the defense said. So her prophetic husband, who said, you're going to die, you're about to die, you're going to die next year, maybe that was why she increased her life insurance. His quote was, prove to me that that's false. Not that you actually have to do that for the prosecution to win, or prove this, yes, for the prosecution to win. Archibald then said that he thought, I agreed with this, that Audrey Baratiero, one of Lori's friends, was making up stuff. You may remember that there was some stunner testimony by Audrey that Lori had, with this evil laugh, threatened her and said terrible things she was going to do to her to murder her. And that it really frightened Audrey. And it was when Audrey was saying, I don't think we can be friends anymore. And Lori said this really threatening, evil thing. And the defense is, where did this come from? You've never said this. You've talked to the police. You've talked to law enforcement. Why now? Why suddenly mention this? And so the defense says, this seems like something that was added, and we don't think this happened in the initial. We don't think that really happened. And the defense also said, look, that woman, Audrey, said she was married to Jesus. She said she didn't have this connection with Lori, didn't approve of what she was doing, yet went with her to 5 different states. And so the defense tried to discount everything that Audrey had said about the threat that Lori made directly to Audrey. Obviously, the prosecution, that would be helpful for them. And notice, I didn't hear them mention that anywhere in the closing. But that would have been helpful to them because Lori, other than that, wasn't shown at any point to be literally violent. And so the defense wants to place a wall. This is Lori may have done bad things, but nothing violent. She wouldn't have participated in any of this. And they want to put it all on Alex. They want to put it all on Chad and have Lori be not connected to that. Will they succeed? No, I don't think they will. But this is the defense argument. And so the defense argument then said that Lori was following Chad. This was all Chad, that she kept asking Chad. And I will say the text messages show that repeatedly, that Lori kept asking Chad what would happen. They would cast out somebody and Lori would say, did it work? And how about that? Where are their numbers now? Are they near death now? that she was always asking Chad. And the defense said, look, because Chad's been to heaven and he knows. And Chad changed the percentage rating for people because he's making it up as he goes. He can't even remember if it's 0% when people die or 100% when people die. And that was very confusing because JJ was 99.99 and was about to die, but Tylee was 0.13 and about to die. And they changed back and forth. I assumed it was because you could either be really low if you were evil or really high if you were good, but who knows? And Barbara Heth, I want to say thank you. I appreciate that. The defense also suggested that they haven't proved who killed Tylee, but Alex and Chad were the ones in the backyard. And remember, they said Chad's the one who said Tylee doesn't like me. And Archibald said, look, 15,000 text messages they show you that they have in evidence. Show me one, any of them that says, so when are you going to kill Tylee? Or one that says, when are you killing JJ, by the way? They don't have those text messages. And it's true, they don't have all the text messages. They explained that in testimony, that some of those text messages were overwritten, that the providers, the carriers, don't save those except for a short period of time. And that's why they weren't able to see those. And they didn't know what exactly the communications were about. They just showed that there were communications. And the defense said, look, they tell you that Lori was involved in killing JJ, but think through it. Chad and JJ were the ones who had an argument just the night before, where Chad got into a scratch fight with JJ and ended up with a scratch on his neck, and JJ had a scratch on his neck. Maybe, the defense said, that was when JJ was hurt. Remember, there was a scratch on his neck that was talked about in the testimony. And Alex was only at that gravesite for 17 minutes, the defense says. So that's not enough time. Alex had to have had help from Chad. Alex and Chad were the two bad guys here, not Lori. So that's the defense argument throughout this. And Lori, it was about this time that the defense lawyer apparently began to cry and said, Lori so wants to testify of Jesus. She wants to tell the world how much she loves Jesus. She wants to tell you she personally met him on more than one occasion. But is Lori a leader or a follower of Chad? She so wants to be a leader, but she's not leading anyone. She's following Chad. She thinks Chad is following Jesus, but he's not. He's unfortunately being led by the storm, which you may recall was a reference that Lori and Chad made to Chad's anatomy. Not the first guy to be led by the storm. And this started a flurry of storm references back and forth throughout all of this for the remainder of the closing arguments. And the defense said people who follow Jesus do good things. They are respectful, kind, serve others. If someone wants you to walk a mile, walk 2 miles. Treat people like you want to be treated. Judge people like you want to be judged. Since you're a sinner, be kind and forgiving of sinners. That's the Jesus we know. That's the Jesus that Lori knew. That's the Jesus Lori taught her children about. That's the Jesus Lori knew until she met Chad Daybell. There was testimony to support that from Colby Ryan when the defense said, now, is this the Jesus that you were taught about? No, really different what my mother taught me. So the defense then sort of wound up with this. No one here thinks Lori actually killed anyone. That's why she's being charged with conspiracy. And they want you to be convinced she's part of this plan, but she wasn't involved. If you find her guilty, it's not going to bring the kids back. What good would it do you to do that? You can't be concerned about it. You just have to follow the law. And there's a lack of evidence here that connects Lori to the murders. If there's anything we've learned about a storm, you hide from a storm, you seek shelter from a storm. Lori spent her whole life protecting her children. Now, of interest, remember that Lori has been very sort of inappropriately calm from what we hear throughout the trial, that she doesn't seem to react to horrible testimony about her own children, to photographs, to other very disturbing evidence. She doesn't react to any of that. And instead, she's very calm, smiles, jokes with her attorneys, and doesn't seem to enter into it. But she was upset after this closing argument. She was crying. I have a personal theory about that. I'm real curious. Feel free to put this in the chat. I'm curious what you think. But I think the reason that she was upset about this is because her attorney threw Chad under the bus. And her attorney said, it's Chad, it's Chad, it's Chad. And I don't think she really wanted that. I think she was trying to protect Chad. That doesn't mean she's not guilty of any of this. I'm not talking about that. But I think that's why she would be upset here when she wasn't upset at the things that most obviously should have been very upsetting, like pictures of her own children in autopsy or as they were being discovered buried in Chad Daybell's backyard. So, and I did see too an interview of her uncle, might have been on Court TV. I'm not sure where I saw it just today, talking about the fact that Lori is talking to her mother every week. And they said, well, how is Lori? How is she handling this? And he said, you know, what you see in court, that sort of passive light, not entering into sort of the deepness of it. He said, what you see in court, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much how she's reacting. So in other words, it wasn't registering is how I read what he was talking about. So then the prosecution did its rebuttal, also very strong. I thought the prosecution rebuttal was well done. They went back to that point. There was one common thread between all the deaths, and that's Lori. Lori was the common thread. Now, after the problem with Charles, she wised up, they said. She waited for the money to hit her bank before she killed Tylee and she killed JJ. She was not a good mom, the prosecution said. When the whole world is out looking for your kids, does a good mom dance on the beach in Hawaii? No. Does a good mom bury her children in the ground and go bury a recent widower? No, that's not good. She knew her children were dead, and she helped plan it, and she encouraged it. She was tired of the obstacles. Remember when Chad referred to the relatives as obstacles? She said, me too. She thought it too. She was tired of JJ, the prosecution said, and she told a lot of lies. They went through some of them. For example, she told people that Tylee was attending BYU, Idaho. The prosecution brought in the registrar who said, nope, not here, never went here, never applied here. She also told Charles Vallow's own children and others that Charles Vallow had died of a heart attack. Not true. He was shot by her brother, Alex Cox. She told people that JJ was with Kay Woodcock, and then she told law enforcement that JJ was with her friend Melanie Gibb in Arizona. Both of those were untrue. The prosecution also said, remember the last thing that Summer Shiflett, Lori's sister, testified to, what she told you? She was asked if Lori had been honest with her about the kids, and her response was that Lori had lied, and she'd done it to cover up her crimes. And then the prosecution said, yes, she lied, and she lied to cover up her crimes repeatedly. Does a good mom do that? Does a good mom jet off to Hawaii while the rest of the world is looking for her kids and not look for the kids herself? No, that's what the prosecution said. I thought this quote was really strong. The innocent don't need to lie, the guilty lie. The prosecution urged them again, take a look at the body cam footage by the pool when Lori was served. She's in Hawaii. The kids are dead, according to the prosecution. Tammy is dead. Chad and Lori are now married, and they're in Hawaii. They're sitting poolside, and she gets served by papers saying she has to produce JJ. They said, take a look at that. Look at her body language. What do you see? What do you see, jury? Pay attention to that. They also said that they wanted the jury to look specifically at the video. What was the other video? The audio of the phone call from Chad to Lori in jail. We talked about that a couple of times, I think, during this live. So they reiterated the hair that was found. They said it wasn't just found in the plastic bag. It wasn't something that was just in the clothing. It was on the tape that was wrapped tightly around JJ. Lori was not just a follower of Chad. They argued Lori was a leader. Chad said grab me by the storm and I will follow you to the end of the universe. He said, he didn't say, you follow me. He said, I'll follow you to the end of the universe. So it was Lori who was the leader. She was heavily involved in part and parcel of all of this. Now, Chad, they pointed out that text message that I said was so important, where Chad texted her about her kids about to go into the light, about to die. And she says, oh, that's sweet. Instead of being appalled, that was the same sequence where he said, Chad said he was going to give Tylee a great deal of pain. Lori said she had no more patience. They pointed out that the death percentages for Tammy, for JJ, were just not low enough. Why were they still here? That she was upset that the death percentages weren't lower for the kids, for Tammy. And if she didn't intend the deaths, the prosecution pointed out, why didn't she report them? If she never wanted that, then why wouldn't she call law enforcement and say, Chad and Alex just killed my 2 kids? Because she clearly knew they were missing. It makes no sense to say she's a good mom when she's not reporting the deaths of her children or that her children are missing. And the prosecution wound up with a statement that Lori made to Zulema, because Lori said, nothing in this life counts for me. The prosecution says, well, make it count for Lori Vallow, that Tylee Ryan will never go to college, that her remains were buried and put in a bucket. Make it count for Lori Vallow that JJ Vallow, a boy with special needs, had a plastic bag over his head and fought for his life. And make it count for Lori that Tammy Daybell had to die so Lori could get to that money. Ladies and gentlemen, reason and common sense. Reason and common sense. You must convict her. And that was how they wound up. Very powerful. I thought the closing arguments were very strong. I thought everybody brought it. It was well done. It was very, very strong. So I want to show you what the jury is going to actually be filling out. Let me see if I can make that a little bit bigger so you can read it. The jury is going to be asked 6 questions. The first is Lori not guilty or guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder of Tylee Ryan? Just a second. I'm not used to lives this long. Just a second. And then, second question, is Lori not guilty or guilty of first-degree murder of Tylee Ryan? So conspiracy to murder Tylee and first-degree murder of Tylee. Then is Lori not guilty or guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder of JJ Vallow? Is Lori not guilty or guilty of first-degree murder of JJ Vallow? So again, conspiracy or first-degree murder or both for JJ Vallow. Number 5, is Lori not guilty or guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder of Tammy Daybell? Now, there is not a straight-up guilty of first-degree murder question for Tammy Daybell. It's conspiracy only for Tammy's death. And then number 6, is Lori not guilty or guilty of grand theft, which remember is $1,000 or greater. So thank you, Marlon. I saw your comment about I am human. That's right. I am. I definitely needed something to drink there. So, okay. Those are the 6 questions that the jury is going to be asked to answer. And the jury will have to answer each and every one. So you can see where that's going to take a little bit of time. And it's not going to happen right away. Does anyone know? Can you put in here, has the jury gone home? Is the jury still there? If you know, let me know. I've been on the live. I can look around and see, but I don't know the answer to that. So I thought if someone knows, let me know what you have seen. At this stage, what we're going to be waiting for is for the jury to make a decision in the case. Now, the jury has a lot of evidence. Typically, if a jury comes back quickly, just a rule of thumb, it's not always the case, but typically if they come back quickly, it's a prosecution verdict, a guilty verdict. If they take time, what that means is that one or more people really weren't convinced that the evidence was actually there for something. Now, in this case, there are 6 different questions they have to answer. So not being sure about one of the 6 might take time, but it doesn't mean there wouldn't be a conviction on the other 5. And so what we're going to be seeing then is whether or not typically it's quick and everybody just says, oh yeah, definitely guilty, or whether there's going to be argument and debate over some of those counts because some of the jurors think that the prosecution just didn't have enough evidence of, you fill in the blank, Tammy, for example. Maybe some jurors would think, well, I'm not really sure that Lori was involved with Tammy. I didn't see any text messages that said that, and Lori was out of state. That's what the defense would want them to say. Or maybe even the grand theft. I think that's probably a fairly strong cause of action for the prosecution, but who knows? Maybe somebody is not convinced that all of the elements were proven for each of those. And since we're waiting, I forgot to look over here. Did anyone, they're still there, quit dinner break an hour ago. All right. No update since. So we know they're still considering, still thinking about it. I would not be at all surprised, given that they're working more or less through dinner. I wouldn't be at all surprised for them to reach a verdict tonight. The fact that they're staying this late suggests to me they're really serious about it. Oh, thank you, Michael Sen. I appreciate that. Do jurors need to write a supplemental analysis explaining why they feel that way? Or do they just have to write guilty, not guilty? Just guilty, not guilty. A lot of times it's even a checkbox. They do not have to write anything explaining it. Occasionally they have to make other findings, but again, it's usually just a checkbox or one sentence where they write yes or no beside everything. I don't know if you were around in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, but there were some things where they had to find multiple things before they could get to the big thing they were being asked to decide. Do you agree with this? Yes. Do you agree with that? Yes. And you had to find all of those before you could hit the last question down there. So the fact that I think, yes, that's a good idea, though. Let's see what questions we've got. I'll go back. We've had a lot of chat. I'm not going to be able to go all the way back, but let's see. Oh, put your question marks at the beginning if you have something that you want to ask, and I'll see. It'll be easier for me to see and maybe get to your question. How long will the jury deliberate? It's up to the jury usually. Very rarely will a judge get in the way. I have seen that happen. I don't know if you remember the Bill Cosby case. The court wanted everybody to be able to deliberate, and I think it was the security came in and said, look, we don't have enough people to man the courthouse all night. We're short some of the law enforcement, and so everybody's got to leave the courthouse at 5:30 or 5 or whatever time it was. They can't keep staying. They can't keep deliberating. But that's unusual. Normally, if the jury wants to stay, the jury's allowed to stay. If it's going to be a long deliberation, typically they would break and go for the next day. But most judges will give them a lot of leeway on that. So I'm going back through seeing about other questions that people ask. And I forgot to say early on about, be sure to hit that like button, by the way. That's another thing I always forget to say. But as far as questions, I forgot to say early on to put your questions at the beginning. I'll have to do one of those YouTube things where I have some tea or something that I hawk as part of my channel. Right now, I'm just having water. That's not the same. Okay, I'm looking for, that was Michael's question. Let's see. I know I saw a bunch of question marks early on and I thought about it. Thank you, Patty. I saw that nice comment. And yes, we are all waiting. We are all waiting to see what the jury is going to do. And I tell you what, it is always so nerve-wracking when you wait for a jury to come back. For an attorney, you have spent so much time preparing the case. You're deeply invested in the case. If it's a civil case, you may have your own money in the case and you are waiting and you don't know what will happen. Now, I think in this case, there's maybe somewhat less suspense. That's giving it away maybe as far as what I think. But I obviously, Gigi just said no verdict today, resuming tomorrow. Okay. Yes, I would have, Christy, I would very much appreciate it if people would hit the like button and subscribe, because we are coming back. We will be back for more if the jury is in fact headed out for the evening, then we will be back tomorrow. And I'm going to go live whenever the jury comes back, and we will go through it. I've got that form. You may notice that when I put that form up, see how I made the chart and I have the jury verdict over there on the side. So we'll fill it out. What does the jury say on each one of those things? Guilty or not guilty? We'll fill it out. We'll do it together. So what if there is one holding out? I know what you're saying, Shauna Gunn. Could there be one person holding out? I think it's more likely that it's just so many counts and they were supposed to go look at particular pieces of evidence. I mean, they were asked to do that by the attorneys. So I just think it maybe took a little more time, and they got through 3 or 4 and were like, oh man, you know what? We're going to have to come back tomorrow. We just can't get it all done. I'm assuming, of course, that y'all are all correct, that Gigi was correct, that they're leaving for the evening. So I'll wait, get a couple more people saying that. But I think that's probably what it is. I think it's more likely that it's just somebody who, I can take that off now. I think it's more likely that they just have more to cover than they could cover in that brief amount of time. That's just my guess. But, there may be somebody saying, I have a problem with the Tammy count and whether or not Lori was truly involved in that, because I don't really see the evidence. It's possible. I think that there's been a great deal of evidence, and other people will try to convince them using some of the text messages and stuff. It may even take them a while to find those text messages, because remember, all of the exhibits that put those things together, those are demonstrative exhibits. They aren't true evidence. So the evidence itself is a lot. So if you were to find this or that particular text message, it might take you a while. It's not put together in an easy format like we used last night on the timeline. By the way, if you are following this case and you didn't see last night's live, be sure to go watch that, because that live takes you through the entire timeline. So it really gives you an overview of the case, so you can kind of understand what was the prosecution's evidence. What are the things that the prosecution has that suggests that Lori Vallow Daybell is guilty? What are the things the defense is arguing on the other side? Okay, Nate Eaton also saying jury is coming back tomorrow. 9 a.m. Hidden true crime. Okay, well, it sounds like lots of people are saying that there's going to be a verdict tomorrow. I am going to be here. You and I will talk. We will cover it, and I will let you know exactly what happens tomorrow. So I will look forward to seeing you tomorrow, whatever time it is. It won't necessarily be our 7 o'clock usual time. We'll just go live when we find out the jury has come back.